There is a war being waged over the meaning of words, and it could spell the end of our free Western societies if it isn't stopped. With a concerted effort by many on the political left today, they are pushing to change the meaning of words or banning them outright to be more progressive. Yet all it is doing is tearing the fabric of our society apart and will ultimately end up doing far more harm than good. It will be our children and grandchildren that will inherit a world torn apart. This war of words stems from a misunderstanding of history and originates from the Communist Manifesto and the ideology which it begot and that permeates down to this day. It was Marx and Engels who broke all history down extremely simplistically into the haves and have-nots. The core premise being that all social institutions are predicated on the arbitrary expression of power. They refer to historical examples at the start of the Communist Manifesto, among others the patricians and plebiscites of the Roman Republic and what was called the conflict of orders. This so-called conflict from circa 500 to 287 BC was documented primarily by the Roman historian Titus Livius, better known as Livy, who wrote about the event centuries after it happened. Further, Rome had been sacked in the intervening time, leaving no contemporaneous records of this event, making Livy's account even more problematic. Not to forget either that Livy's histories had a political agenda to cast Augustus Caesar, his emperor and patron, in the best possible light. The Greek historian Polybius, circa 200 to 118 BC, who was born within living memory of the event and wrote a history about the Romans, didn't mention it. Thus, this extremely problematic reading of history formed the basis of a cultural Marxist movement that continues to operate on the same assumptions today, dividing society by power alone. To quote Michel Foucault, power is everywhere because it comes from everything. Only now, rather than the means of production being the key to power, language instead has been identified as the building block of society, and it is here that the present-day war is being waged. So it might be worth considering the importance of language in our societies before we can talk about the war itself. Our Western institutions have been built up over centuries, and they have been ingrained not only into our language but even into our subconscious. Some values we hold without question, despite sometimes them being in contradiction to our best interests. According to John Searle, collective intentionality is all that holds our society together. We assign status functions to things and people, and through this we are able to create institutional realities, which helps to increase the sophistication of our society. Money, for example, was just a piece of paper, and now it's not even that. We assign it a function so that we can use it to trade, etc. And with that concept of money, society was able to expand upon it with increasing complexity with things like banks and stock exchanges. So we apply these linguistic representations not only to objects but also to concepts and even people such as presidents. But these functions only exist so long as there is a collective intentionality holding the system together. Otherwise, the president is just another person and the title is meaningless. But if these social systems are changed so radically that a large portion of the population no longer shares in this intentionality, then there is nothing else to hold the institution of society together, with the first big shock likely bringing it all collapsing down. John Searle claims that if one can gain control of the vocabulary, then one has gone a long way to controlling status functions and hence society itself. In North Korea, language has been weaponized to such an extent that it's almost impossible to believe coming from a Western country. It's unimaginable for us not to have a word for love other than for your dear leader. But to understand love, one needs to understand the concept of I. Even though it is a cultural thing, and to some degree it's similar in South Korea, the concept of I, it has been completely removed from the language in the North. People like the dictators of North Korea have worked out that by controlling language, you can control everything so long as you can stay in power. The meaning of words is being changed in Western society too, not by the natural process that has occurred over centuries, but by ideologues who seek to transform society into some utopia. A family can now be any kind of arrangement, while there is a push for definitions like birthing parent, now that supposedly men can give birth. Online dictionaries change their meanings of words in real time to conform with one side of the political aisle. But this is far more sinister than just changing words to be more inclusive. In the West, many now also believe words are only for power. Quoting Foucault again, it is meaningless to speak in the name of or against reason, truth or knowledge. For the cultural Marxists, words have no meaning, as there is no truth or even knowledge. Words are being wielded like a club then, to beat down your opponents. Instead, all views are equal and valid, and that is why Ilhan Omar, the US House representative, can suggest that the US and Israel are no better than Hamas or the Taliban. Even criticising her is now anti-black or Islamophobic. Words only used to scare opposition into silence, just like in North Korea. While at the same time, thugs on the streets, like Antifa and Black Lives Matter, openly threaten that they will burn everything down if they don't get their way. Seemingly only white people can be racist, and only people on the right can be fascist. Even maths is now racist because there is a disparity between the results of different groups. Also, Biden has recently declared that white supremacy is the worst threat to the United States, not China, Russia, or jihadi terrorists. Redefining extremism to include your political opponents may be the next step, if it hasn't already begun. Even using the wrong pronoun is considered bigotry. People of faith will likely be the first to be rounded up for maintaining values like that of the traditional family as preferable, which is fast becoming outlawed even to talk about in your own home, much like what happened 100 years ago in the Soviet Union. How long before the FBI or the local equivalent are knocking at your door for using words that until recently had been used by the majority for hundreds of years? John Searle is right to say that if one controls the vocabulary, then one can change society. But what I believe he hasn't considered is what is happening at the subconscious level, as per Jordan Peterson's concept of a pattern of being, and how that, over time, it will prevail over any large-scale changes made by individuals or ideologies. The ancient Athenians sentenced Socrates, 470 to 399 BC, to death for supposed impiety and corrupting the youth, our earliest example of government overreach. But for all their folly, they were unable to control thought and instead helped perpetuate his memory for millennia. And so there is no way to control society over the long term, even for North Korea, because eventually free thought and speech will prevail, as Orwell also predicted. Not only is it dangerous to try to forcefully change language, but ultimately it's futile. Language is less about power and more about cooperation. We have built our modern societies upon it, and it is all that is holding it together. Language isn't perfect, but we can still do great things with it, like finding other solutions to a world of limited resources without reverting to violence, or building a society that can increase life expectancy while reducing poverty across the planet. It is imperative, therefore, to resist this cultural Marxist takeover of our language and continue to insist on our right of free speech and refuse to adopt their new speak. After all, that is why the first person who threw an insult rather than a rock, in a sense, started society. If we restrict language, we only increase the chances that people will revert back to throwing rocks, and that is why understanding history, not twisting it, matters.